We are here backstage in the tuning room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with James Hetfield, Kirk Hammett, Lars Ulrich, Rob Trujillo. We are going to do some time travel talking about a record that came out 30 years ago, almost to the month. But I want to actually open with two quotes that I conveniently lifted from my own story about that record and the band in 1988. And one of them was, and this really is sort of a lead up to what we want to get to, the heart of this album and the box set, this giant box of history that I need a forklift to get it up to my apartment, but the rewards are
wait till
incredible.
the Black Album one.
One of the things, I was talking with you, Kurt, and we were talking about the way at the time in 88, 87, the way that the mainstream press, particularly rock critics and such, were talking about the band. And one of the quotes that you made was that people were writing out the band as, quote, ugly guys singing ugly things to ugly music, which really was the perception in a lot of corners. But then there was also a quote from somebody. This is a direct quote. "I knew they were destined to make a huge mark that they're just beginning to make now. Metallica is going to be one of the bands you look back on in the year 2008 that people will still listen to the way I still listen to Zeppelin and Sabbath albums." That was Jason Newsted. And
how prophetic was that?
And the thing is, we're now in 2018 with a record that in some ways was the first top 10 album. It was your first album after the loss of Cliff Burton, and it was your first real working experience with Jason. And at the same time, it was the last album you made in that way, that extreme, with songs that long, that intense, and that topical for almost 15 years. So in a way, it was like the peak of something, and it was also kind of the end of something. Like you had gone to a point that you almost couldn't go past. You had to change yet again. When you look back at this record, do you see it as, what kind of a mark does it leave for you, James?
Well, you mentioned it's like the beginning and ending of a lot of different things. They kind of overlapped. And I think for me, I think the point where Lars and I had driven the band at that point, we weren't sure where it could go after that. Obviously sitting in a producer's seat, pretending we knew what we were doing.
For 5 months.
Yes. And, sonically, obviously you can tell who kind of mixed that album. But so after that, it's like we realized, okay, we can go outside of the box here. We can ask for some help production-wise. Let's focus more on the music. As far as songwriting goes, I remember being on that tour, playing these songs live and looking at the set lists just shrink. That, we used to be able to play a lot of songs. Now we can only play this many songs because they are so long. So realizing, the connection between the studio, making music, getting creative, and bringing it into a live setting, it started to become clearer that some of these songs were getting a little long-winded, and maybe we should take a look at that.
There's also an emotional component, because there is the transition from Cliff to Jason, and also just the willingness to say, okay, we've gone through an enormous trauma, which was documented in the Master of Puppets box with those live shows, and at the same time saying we've got to get back to it. We can't just quit. And yet you have, I think the song title that summed up that album for me in retrospect was "The Frayed Ends of Sanity." And it was a song that you didn't play for the next 24 years.
Maybe we're afraid.
Well, actually,
it would be so cathartic that we would be healed.
Well, there is a certain emotional aspect to it that, short as straw, harvester of sorrow, to live is to die, uplifting stuff.
Well, no doubt about it. There was that cloud of grief
following us for quite a while, and just reflecting on what you have to say about those titles, and I think back at it, and yeah, maybe subconsciously, there was we were absolutely still dealing with all that stuff, but I mean, we were pretty young still, and I can only talk about myself during that period, but I did not know how to process it. I hadn't lost someone like that under those circumstances. I don't think any of us had. And so I think subconsciously we just buried a lot of stuff, and that stuff was struggling to get out. And I think subconsciously a lot of it got escaped through the music. I mean, I honestly believe that in retrospect.
How about for you, Lars? Because, in some ways, the drumming and the intensity of what you had to do on a lot of those songs, it can be almost like a physical release to get stuff out. Were you conscious of that, or was it?
When I think back on that time, for me, it's part of a story, So obviously, yes, like James was referring to, it. When I think of Justice, it slots in between Master of Puppets and the Black Album. So I have a tendency to kind of look at these experiences very sort of practically. And so there was this whole Puppets thing. Then, like you're saying, Jason came in. Obviously, and we've talked 1,000 times about this, we were not able to process grief. None of us knew really how to deal with it. So we all jumped in various liquor bottles and gave Jason a really hard time because what the fuck was he doing here? And I mean, the whole thing was so bizarre. And at that, when I think back to that time now, I just remember, we always kept moving. It was always, we never sat still. And the only reason actually we had a little bit of a break that spring, we'd finished the Master Puppets, and then we started writing the first couple things, first few notes. I think the first thing we were writing was the Blackened. We were over in San Rafael at some rehearsal studio, and then we're supposed to go play Saturday Night Live, and then James broke his arm, and then there was a kind of a break in the action, and then we sort of, well, now what? And then the Garage EP happened, and then we built the studio in my house on Carlson Boulevard, and then we went to work on writing the stuff when we came back from a few festivals. And for me, musically, we were just picking up where we left off. I wish I could tell you that at least I was conscious of the fact that the accident or any of that played a specific role in choices of riffs or choices of lyric subjects or anything, but I don't recall it that way. It just felt like, here we go again.
That the motivation
it was
was
like
really the thing that was...
Well, I think there was...
momentum.
It was
really what
momentum
you had.
is the word that I think of, and at that time, it just felt like there was this... obviously opposite to what it is now, but it was like we belonged on the road. Home is the road. Home is movement. Home is touring. Home is out there living, doing all that stuff in all these different crazy places, and always just never standing still, always moving forward. And it was just, the records were almost like a catalyst to just keep the touring going. And so, it was like we left off on Master Puppets, and then, like James is saying, the songs got longer and crazier and more progressive and more sideways, and and that sort of ran into a wall over the course of the tour for the next year and a half, when like he was saying, we sort of, okay, now we're in Greenville, South Carolina, and here comes 3 Justice songs over the course of 30 minutes, and everybody's like, huh? And it was like, well, maybe we need to relook at this. But for me, I can't tell you that the frayed ends of sanity was something particular to that time. It was always about movement.
Before we get to the process, I'm curious, Rob, as someone who would have been an outsider a fan listening to this record, what was your impression of that album the first time you heard it, both as music and as something that spoke to you as a young man?
I always thought I thought of Justice as more of a concept album, and
A concept about what?
just everything from the system and like some of the titles that you had. It's like, I think what happens with a lot of bands and what happens with Metallica is it's easy for the fan to create his vision of, it's open to interpretation. So there's the idea that you process of what it means and what it is, and it's sort of a journey that you take from the album cover, which was totally amazing, probably my favorite, so the music comes to life through the album cover and what you're listening to, and the unique, we'll get into the sound, I'm sure, but I mean, all of that stuff played a role in this really special album, and it was really very different from what had been done prior. So it was an exciting time. I used to go running in the mountains, in Santa Monica Mountains, with my cassette, my my headphones, Walkman, and that was sort of, every Metallica album, that's what I tested it to, how fast I could jog and run or whatever.
Make you run faster.
Yeah, and it was for me an exciting time. And then when the tour came around and stuff, that was sort of the talk of the town.
Well, you've done this really forensic approach to each of the records, from Kill 'Em All, Lightning, Master, and now Justice, and with the riff tapes, the demos, the rough mixes. In going back through Justice in particular, which is really the album alone was an enormous document, big enough to be a double album. What is it that you realize about that working progress, that process by which you were putting songs together, but the songs actually were, it's almost like architecture. There's actually these sheets in the book where, from the sessions, where I think it's the tape counter numbers, and it actually breaks down solo 1, solo 2, pre-chorus, back to verse 1, and this goes on for like 2 columns, so that you've actually mapped out the music, whereas most people write songs and it's like, here's the verse, here's the bridge, here's the outro. You are actually building something with a much different structure even than you had on Master of Puppets.
Yeah, it's kind of like the building of a house, like you said. Here's the things we need. What else would be really cool in here? What's the finishing work, and what's the overall look and feel? You're right. It was, every song was a riff tape in itself, and we had so many riffs that we wanted to get them all in. So we were jamming riffs in there, forcing them in. When you talk about kind of the craziness of frayed ends or something, that all of a sudden it goes over this way, and trying to outdo ourselves that way. How many riffs can we get in one song?
Were you guided by
I
any
think
particular logic of that?
Well, I think one thing, as I'm sitting here really trying to dig deeper, I think by playing together, by touring, by growing, whatever was happening, I think we were getting better. Literally just getting better at what we were doing. We were more just sort of just on top of what we were doing. It felt like maybe we were just more confident steering the train, the ship, whatever. And I think so we could do like frayed ends. I don't think we would be capable of doing frayed ends 5 years earlier on Kill 'Em All, on Ride the Lightning, because we just didn't have the chops or the skills yet. And I think at that time still, it was very much, there was this kind of underlying thing about ability and about chops and about what's Slayer doing and what's Megadeth doing, and all this. We just, I think of this record as still the next step in that. It wasn't really until Bob Rock showed up a couple years later and started challenging us in the way we were writing, the way we were recording, the way we were arranging, the way we would look at everything. Justice was just the next record, same process, but more. It was same process, but everything was exaggerated. More riffs, longer songs, crazier sideways shit, and it was inevitable that it would run into a wall.
Well,
Because there was no place further to go.
It's
know?
interesting because I actually listened to the whole disc of the riff tapes, and all those bits that were coming up.
God bless
And
you.
It was, and it's interesting because there's
hard
one.
work.
Get a
There's
medal
one
for
from
that.
'87. One of your James, one of your tapes where you're playing a piece of Harvester of Sorrow, but what actually ends up in there also is Eye of the Beholder. And there's another one from October of '87. It's a writing session. I guess you guys are doing at your place in El Cerrito, and you're playing Blackened, and suddenly in the middle there's a bit of Harvester. So it was like any one of these bits could have been in any other song.
It's like,
and yet
this
you,
riff needs to make it on the album.
Yeah.
It needs to make it on the album. What songs are going to fit in?
is
That
there
was
like an
always that
example of
puzzle.
how
I mean,
how that
There was always that puzzle.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes back. That goes back to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
beginning, and
That's
that
part of our
still,
writing.
and it's still. I mean, if we sat here and talked about hardwired to self-destruct, I mean, that's still part of our DNA, and I think that is when Metallica works. There are times when we've forced different ways, and that's maybe when something different and cool comes up, but a lot of people sit there and go like, what the fuck are they doing? But when Metallica really is OG Metallica, that is what we do. It's just this giant puzzle.
if you want to play and illustrate anything at any time, feel free. But
Well,
it's
I mean, going back to the arrangements, I mean, we were kind of already on that course, going down that path with songs like Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, and a song like Injustice for All, isn't that really that far away from a song like Master of Puppets or Ride the Lightning? Definitely has more parts,
Yeah.
definitely has more riffs, but I mean, we were slowly inching in that direction anyway. And another thing I have to say to pick up on what Lars said, in the late 80s, it was just a thing, everyone wanted to show how much they can play. It was the time of all these guitar solo albums, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, and you had a lot of progressive metal bands, Dream Theater, and there was a real emphasis on playing back then. It was just a short window, like between 1986 to 1989, but I definitely felt that, and I think some of that crept into this album, and just wanting to show people that we're a metal band, but we can actually play intricate stuff, even more intricate stuff, without really being a full-on prog band and so I mean, it was a sign of the times.
what was the actual logic? Let's just pick one song as an example. The actual logic
Logic,
of building Blackened. Because actually, that's an interesting song because that's the one that has the one co-writing credit for Jason.
Well, the main riff was Jason's. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember after he joined, I mean, I don't know if we had tuning rooms at the time, but I mean, that was written on the bass, right? I think.
Yeah, he came over to my apartment at the time in Albany, and not New York, Albany, in California. But yeah, he came over, and when we were just hanging out, and we were just starting to get some ideas together. It's like, hey, what do you got? And that was one of the things. The one thing that would always stand out for me is he would play that thing, and just the way the riff was different every time at the end, it felt really fresh and really cool.
Because it would keep coming through, but then there'd be that little twist at the end that would sort of make it different,
Yep.
lead into another bit, and then when you came back, it had that assurance about it, but there was still that twist in the tail.
Exactly. It was rolling, but you didn't know which way it was going to roll for a second, but you could still hang on to it.
But having gotten that riff, what do you think? Okay, what would go well with that? In a way, it's an interesting logic because it's a kind of composition that really stands because the record clearly does have a legacy, and yet when you look at it, and I look at those tape sheets where it's actually broken down, any one of those pieces might have gone somewhere else, but clearly there was an internal logic, writing-wise and ultimately vocally, because there's actually one version of Blackened in the box where you're playing the riff and humming the vocal melody. There's no words, but clearly you've got an idea of what's got to sail over top.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's always something that I feel I've been pretty good at is, you know, the drummer's doing something, the guitar's doing something, doesn't have to be the same, and then the vocal's going to, you know, the way they work together. I've always thought of the voice as one of the instruments. So here's a percussive thing, just like I'm playing drums on the guitar, essentially, and then same with my singing, you know, just another rhythm that's happening along with that. And that's just part of building a song.
Well, out of the 36 parts in Justice that are listed on that one sheet that's in the book, what would have been the point where, okay, we are actually starting to compose And Justice for All?
We say that about every single album. Just press the red button and record it all, and then we'll figure out what's good. Let's just jam, let's just write, let's just create, and let's let it organically happen. Or let's take this riff that we love and force it in somewhere.
Just
there was a
jam
bit
it
of
in.
everything. There was a bit of everything. But I think the jamming came a little later. This was extremely detailed, very precise. We wanted to be as tight as fuck, as tight as we could ever be, and not just playing wise, but sonically. We wanted it to punch you in the face, and that. I think that was our motivation. As far as sound wise, we wanted it to jump out. We were obviously in a transition, a dark place, but it was darker than
you knew
other places that I've been before, but I've been in a lot of darkness. So for me, it was just kind of the next thing. And what do you do with that? Well, you write about it. You put it out there, and I do remember people saying, well, wow, now that, Cliff died, you're not going to write about death anymore. It's like, what? Now there's even more reason to write about it,
Because actually one of the earliest riff tapes that's in the box, there's a couple of late 86 ones. One of them is for Dyer's Eve.
Mm.
So whether that lyric concept was already there, clearly you were moving into, as you say, a pretty dark and intense place, whether you knew it or not.
Right. I think, all of the albums, well, besides Kill 'Em All was, that was us as babies. We had those songs
Babies
forever.
with attitude.
The first one we actually sat down and wrote, Ride the Lightning. Then Master Puppets. We're getting topical. And then, and Justice for All, very topical. But also there started to be a little more internal stuff showing up, not so much opinions, but my experience with it.
Could you see that, Lars, as the songwriting developed? Could you see that turning inward a bit, or was it maybe not as evident until...
I guess when I look back in my mind, the way all this connects is when Bob Rock showed up, things changed, and there was a whole different kind of thing. I think one thing that's interesting to bring up is that we did attempt to record with somebody else.
With Mike Klink.
Somebody else, so Fleming Rasmussen did Ride the Lightning, Fleming Rasmussen did Master Puppets, and we were like, the Guns N' Roses record had come out. There was a lot of, it sounded like a band. It was like there was this sound thing happening, this attitude, and I remember we would kind of sit there and go like, wow, whatever, let me just try somebody else. And then Mike Klink came in, and God bless him and his patience and so on, and James and I were in LA, and what that last maybe like a couple weeks, 3-4 weeks, something like that, and it just didn't gel, because I think primarily we just weren't ready to let somebody in yet. We had a way we had a way that in our minds worked. We were incredibly guarded about Metallica. At that time still, there were so many, record companies would get involved and A&R people would get involved, and there was this whole thing with money and promotion and MTV, and so there's all this stuff, and we were like, fuck all that. We're independent. Nobody's gonna fuck with our shit. James and I are the gatekeepers. Anybody that comes in to try to unsettle this, we're just gonna fucking shove them away. Do you know what I mean? So, we called Clink. Again, God bless him. It lasted 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, and then Fleming came over, and we were right back to what we knew. And again, not about right or wrong or better or worse, or it was just like, this is what we want. No, this is what we want. And I think what we had is we sort of found a way to, I don't know, like, as I'm sitting here listening to what everybody's saying and try to just think about what was really going on at the time, I think that there was, it was a lot about balances, so we found a way to get, I guess primarily James and I, to have our voices in the writing, in the parts, in the sonics, and it was not necessarily about the big picture, but it was about the way that it could all coexist without anybody having to take a back step, or it was like we were all chained together until we would move forward. This was the way it worked. It was like, why do the kick drums sound like that? Well, part of the reason the kick drums sound like that is because there was no other place for the kick drum to sort of come through, because James's guitar was sort of here. So the kick drum would live up there or a little bit down here. So there's a reason for a lot of this stuff. Nobody sat there and said, we're going to have a record that's going to be mixed this way. That's going to, it's sort of like, we weren't capable of thinking at that level. So a lot of it was a result of what I think were sort of balancing points along the way to just sort of make it all work for the big picture.
What state were
I don't know if does any of that make sense?
No, actually, it's interesting. It does make sense, because I was actually thinking, listening back to the record again the other day, is that, one of the reasons Justice seems like possibly the most extreme record you ever made is because the tone of it is so vicious. The guitars are really compressed, the drums are really compressed. It's really got this. But it sounds like this frayed end of sanity, like someone's really on the edge of just losing it, and it really cuts like a knife.
Right, but it's important to, I think it's important to say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, dude, but it wasn't planned that way. It wasn't like we didn't sit there and go, in a year from now we're going to have a record that sounds this particular way. It I don't know if the word accidental, but it's just the result of the instinctive choices that were made along the way to sort of what we considered to make it work, to keep people at bay, all that kind of shit. You know what I mean? This is our thing. Nobody's going to fuck with it. Nobody's going to touch it. Nobody's going to get involved. We're the gatekeepers. Fuck you, That was kind of my recollection of that whole year.
Was Jason really integrated performance-wise? Because when I then heard those songs performed live on that tour, when I went out with you guys in Sheffield, Belfast, and Dublin, he was clearly a huge presence in that sound. One of the things that has been a topic of discussion for 30 years is, where did the bass go? Mm-hmm. And yet clearly as a performer and as an instrumentalist and as a writer, he had started coming into his own. How would you characterize what his place in that was, because maybe people didn't necessarily hear it immediately on the record?
I think it had to be extremely bittersweet for him. Like a dream come true, but I'm stepping into someone's shoes who can never be filled. It must have been very difficult. And for him and for us, it was difficult. It just truly was. And, Psych 101 will tell you that all our anger, our grief and sadness got directed at him when it, not all of it, but quite a bit of it he was an easy target. And I think there were a couple things about Jason, his personality. He felt he was goofy enough to take it, which was a positive for him. I think he was such a fan, and we hated that. We hated that part. We wanted to unfan him and become
as hard as you were.
Yeah, as hard as we were. So trying to beat the fan out of him, trying to also get him to play something different, like Cliff would. He played with a pick, and he would follow whatever I would do. And I remember there were times where I'd be playing, I'd just turn around so he couldn't see what I was playing, so he couldn't follow me. It's like, do whatever you want to do, So, but obviously live, he fit right in. He was a great force, and you heard the bass live. So, and he wasn't afraid to step up to the mic and bark whenever he felt like it. And he would sweat. He would really sweat, and he put a lot into the live show. So that gained a lot of respect, at least I think, for us once we started touring with him.
Yeah, and also, I think Jason tried again to try to balance things out by kind of like really being prominent on those songs when they were played live. I mean, he played the shit out of those songs, and you can tell that he was like giving it his all. And I think some of that was because he was trying to compensate for not being heard on the album, and that was his way to for his parts to be heard.
Let people know, hey, I'm there.
Yeah, in the live situation, and so I think there was a bit of that.
In the writing phase, the songs that you've got credits for include Justice, Eye of the Beholder, Frayed Ends, and Dyer's Eve. At what point would you come in with ideas or riffs? Were you gathering things and putting them into like a big basket and listening to stuff, or were you coming in as things were developing to say, here's something that could go here to add to the length of the song?
Well, back then we would basically just get all our riff tapes and just throw them in a big pile, and the best parts would be gleaned from those tapes, and they would be put into the songs. I mean, basically that's how it was done back then. I mean, it really, we've had different approaches to that over the course of different albums, but back then, basically, I would have a handful of riffs, and I would give it to these guys, and then come back, X amount of days later, and I would hear those riffs in context of the songs. And I'll go, oh yeah, I recognize that riff, and then oh yeah, I recognize that riff that James was playing 6 months ago, and it's in this song too. I mean, that's just how it was.
I cannot emphasize the word puzzle enough. I mean, brought it up. I mean, it's fucking like a puzzle.
Yeah.
It's just like Kirk is saying. There's fucking, I don't know, 50 riffs or 100 riffs in a fucking basket or bowl or some sort of vessel, and then hey, that one goes there. No, that one goes there. Wait, that one could work better there. Flip that one, put that one in harvester, put that in the. It's like it's just a fucking puzzle.
Yeah.
Were you flipping them around in the studio as well?
No. By the time we got to LA, all the songs were done. I mean, it wasn't. I don't think it was till maybe even the Load era. The songs were pretty much done. Certainly in the Fleming era, all the songs were 100%, 99.9% done by the time we started recording them. The changes were borderline non-existent. With the Black Album, it started, Bob Rock would start sort of, hey, double the chorus. I'm like, the fuck you talking about? But no, the songs were done by the time we left. By the time we left El Cerrito, the songs were done.
And getting back to the arrangements of the songs, I mean, up to that point, we learned the songs, and we would just learn them. But when Justice came around, I had to write out a roadmap, and sometimes I'd have to use 2 sheets of paper. Okay, and it was essential to do that, really essential to do that, because there were so many parts. And if you lost your way in the middle of that song and these guys would move forward, if you didn't know where you were at that map, there's no way of catching up to the part that you were supposed to catch up to, you know, because there's no real point of reference at that point. You needed the whole arrangement written out, just so that, you know, if you missed something, you'd be able to follow the band and go, okay, I'm gonna catch him at this point, you know. And that's how it was.
Catch you at the end. Maybe.
Actually,
Yeah.
Rob, when you started learning to play these songs, you know, I'm going to use Frayed Ends as an example again because it was played for the first time in 2014, which was like
And Rob,
10
can I just say he was a major motivator for that.
Definitely.
So when I first joined the band, there were 2 songs that I wanted to play, and one of them was Dyer's Eve,
Stairway to Heaven.
and
And my Shrona.
and the other one was Frayed Ends of Sanity. So I remember being in Paris in 2003, and I was with James. We're walking to go to dinner, and I'm like, okay, you know, the vibe is good. This is my chance. I'm going to ask him. And I was like, what do you think about playing Dyer's Eve? You know what I mean? And it seemed like the band was more open to exploring some of the deeper cuts and the spirit
darker
of that.
corners of justice.
What's that?
The darker corners.
The
of
darker
justice.
corners. It seemed like they weren't ready for Frayed, but they were ready for Dyer's, and so we actually ended up playing that one back then. Frayed was something that I started working on my own way before we played it in 2014. I started working that at home, and I just trying to dissect it as best as I could because I knew someday we're going to play this song. We
But how
have to
did
play
you
this song.
dissect it? Like, did you actually have to create a roadmap like Kirk's?
Yeah, I did. I had to create it, but then, and I think James will also agree with me on this. Frayed is the type of song that you've got to, at some point, really, in terms of the rhythm side, you know, whether it's bass or rhythm guitar, drums, you have to bring that into your system. It has to be a part of you physically because it grooves, you know, and in order, you know, to read it is one thing, but at a certain point, it has to be in you. You know,
It has to flow.
It has to really be in you. All that.
And then it flips around.
It flips around, so you've got to know it. You've got to breathe it, and that takes time. Yeah.
All right.
Well, one of the things that was really instrumental in this record album cutting through to people was One, and lyrically, it really is a remarkable song in the sense that it actually, even without seeing the video for it, you got this sense of incredible dread, incredible desperation, and actual physical, almost the feeling of someone physically evaporating. And the video, and we'll get to that in a second, really helped with that. But in writing that song, you know, Blackened has all the ecology in it, Harvester, Shorter Straw. These have a topical feel to it, but One is actually interesting because it's written almost in the first. It's written in the first person.
Right.
Like this is not just watching CNN a lot. Where did this really come from for you, and what did you hear in the music that got you there?
Whoa. Yeah. To me, One is it's like the ultimate darkness. It's the ultimate loneliness that, you know, the most lonely you could ever feel, really. I recall I have 2 older half-brothers, and they were in college, and I was a young kid, and this was, I guess, mid-'70s. And he told me about this book he was reading, or a movie that he had seen, maybe the book as well. I guess the book was from the 30s, and then
By Dalton Trumbull.
Trumbull made the movie in the 70s, I guess, and
Johnny Got His Gun.
yeah, Johnny Got His Gun. And my brother telling me about this. Wow, there's this crazy thing about this guy whose arms and legs are blown off. He's deaf and blind, and it scared the shit out of me. Like, but how does he talk? How does he eat? How does he communicate? How does he get around? He doesn't. you know, and they don't know he's alive even. I mean, he is alive, but he doesn't know how to tell them he doesn't want to be alive. I mean, it's like the biggest trap. You're stuck in this trap and you can't get out. So it brought up a lot of emotion for me and a lot of fear. And so when I was writing the song, obviously reading the book, you know, he couldn't speak for himself. So I put a voice to him. Obviously there's a voice for him in the movie and in the book especially, but just talking about I'm trapped and I don't know what to do. And, you know, that sense of no one could help him, nothing could help him, was pretty much one of the ultimate fears for me. You know, as a kid, for me, feeling disconnected, not being able to ask for help, not knowing where to go for help, that plugged right in to some of my fears.
Because then you turned it personal in Dyer's Eve. You actually spoke not just in the first person, but in your own first person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, writing the letter to your parents. You know, here's what I really want to say, at least then, you know, and it was nice to get that out as well. But one was such a scary and dark place. It was easy to write, really was, because it felt very comfortable.
Well, one of the things that I remember from the tour that I was on, we were in Belfast, and I remember, and actually I wrote about this, I was sitting in a car with you, Lars, and Peter Mensch, and you were listening to a proposed edit of one on the car stereo. And it was interesting because there was this discussion about, should we do this? Is this really the right thing to do? Are we, you know, cannibalizing the song in any way? And one of the things that Peter said, which was very interesting, he said that he actually likened the band to the Grateful Dead of heavy metal, because you could reach a certain audience. You were doing great on the road, but if you were going to go to the other level, you needed something else. You needed that single that was going to connect. And it's incredible that, in fact, one, which is, as you say, the ultimate darkness, became that. How hard was it to accept the fact that we have to cut it in order to get it through?
I would say that my recollection is that it became easier because it felt like we were standing our ground a lot. And so, you know, the medium of video, I think that we had always looked at as something that was sort of selling out, or something that belonged to a different mindset. And then I think we started realizing that you could attribute or use the same approach to creativity in the video that you did in the songs. And for me, that was kind of a breakthrough. It was like, it doesn't have to be left to somebody else. It can be something that we control. There's that word again. It's something that we can control, or that we can have enough of a creative voice in that it still feels like it's an extension of who we are. So, you know, when and I can't remember if that happened in Belfast, or I remember something in Paris. I remember there was a conversation in Paris at the Santa's place with the red backstage. I think it was Peter and Cliff that maybe were in Paris or something. We had a conversation about, like, we can do a video that's as much on our terms as making the records or playing the rock shows or whatever we were doing. And when that happened, it felt good about sort of taking the next step. And you know, at that time, obviously, you could still feel that there was this whole groundswell of music fans and that were experiencing Metallica for the first time and being really turned on by what they heard. And so it I think it really felt like we were still standing our ground. They were coming to us rather than us going to them. So the small compromises that we were doing felt like it was still kind of cool enough or accepted. I can't remember the details. You know, I can't remember if there wasn't there also an edit for Whom the Bell Tolls? I mean, there was. I don't think
Yes,
one.
there was one for Whom the Bell Tolls.
I don't think
but again,
one,
that one flew over the radar.
Yeah, I don't think one was the first song that was edited. I think there was something about
Fade to Black.
Sanitarium. What?
Fade to Black. We had an edit.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the word single, for better or worse. I mean, I remember, among the first couple conversations I had with Cliff Bernstein on the phone before we were even like together as a unit, it was like, for whom the bell tolls, for whom the bell tolls, for whom the bell tolls. And then it's like, I got to give that to radio or whatever. And maybe the intro went from 32 bars to 16 or something. I can't remember. I think we were okay. This was not the big sellout of life here. So, if one went from 8 minutes to 6.5 minutes, it was like, okay, this is tolerable. But, if this can open up, I think the thing was always that if this will open up and bring more people, it will expose them to what we're doing. And then they discover the record, then they discover Puppets, then they discover Lightning, then they discover Slayer, then they discover Diamond Head, then they discover Merciful Fate. There were so many people in America at that time that didn't have access to heavy music because it wasn't on the menu of what the major record companies were serving, right? And so it's like nobody knew what independent music was or whatever. So I remember that we were part of some conversations about if we could help bridge that gap to get, people that were into, say, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest to discover that there was still more heavier stuff out there that they would maybe like.
Well, this is actually a good moment to bring in Michael Salomon, who was the director of the video for One. And yes,
Hello.
here
Michael!
he comes.
addressing the subject of perceived compromise is a great one because, it has happened in little bits all along our career. And, you either embrace change and use it to your advantage,
As a
or
lever.
point it, in the right direction, or you're afraid of it and you turn around and kind of maybe stay the same size or don't grow at all. And I was afraid of the video, because whenever we'd turn on MTV, it'd be Asia or some Toto or something, and that was
Not to mention
what
names
we
or
wanted.
anything, but there
not
you
at
go.
all. But that, the perception was, okay, we're joining that.
Yeah.
And when we didn't want to join that, so when they asked us, we need a video, that helped a lot, first of all. And I think there was one moment when I was at the Stone on Broadway in San Francisco, there to see some band, I don't know, some metal band, and some kid came up to me and he spit on me. And he says, "You sold out. You made a video." And right there, I went, "Yes, we did. Fuck you." And that's when I started to realize that, okay, you can stay where stay small and in this thing, but if you have something to say that's really important, you need to utilize these things, whether it's video, whether it's the internet, whatever's coming our way, a movie. That's what you got to do. You got to go for it.
Michael, what were the first discussions you had with the band about visualizing a song like One? Because you ended up using footage from the film,
Right.
and yet at the same time you needed to get them in it to show how they connected to the images that are in that classic film.
Right. Well, I was brought into it. Actually, I don't quite remember how I was brought into it, but I know that there was a concept, and I talked to Lars on the phone quite a bit before the video became what it was. And he had kind of explained that there was this movie that they wanted to intercut with the band, and they weren't quite sure how it would work together. I wasn't either. And I think the first time I actually met all of you was on the set and I have to say that I was a partner with Bill Pope, who was the photographer, and he kind of directed the live performance section. And I was brought in mainly as an editor to try and figure out how to interweave the movie with the song.
And that's actually really the important thing, because to integrate the performance aspect and then have that footage, which is, even at this remove, is still incredibly graphic. That image of the guy on the hospital
It is.
bed and the doctors around him basically dismembering him.
Well, I remember bringing in a rough cut. I had actually gotten the original track, the 7.5 minute song, and we had found an old dirty print in Italy that had to be, transferred like 3 different times, so it looked horrible. And I kind of experimented with where I could put the movie in between a lot of the breaks and the music, covering up most of your solos.
Yeah, I
Which I'm
remember. I had to speak up about that. I was like, at least give me some FaceTime during the solo.
Right. But I remember bringing it in, and you guys obviously, because it was the day that you were shooting your performance, I brought in this cut that had a lot of blank spaces where you were going to be put in, and I had all the movie pieces that I thought were appropriate intercut with it. And I believe you looked at it, you shook your head like you didn't understand what was going on, which I'm sure you didn't, because it was just these black holes with.
It's me most of the time.
And I believe you
What is this, by the
rolled
way?
your eyes and walked out of the room about halfway through.
Yeah.
So that was
A couple
like
things
me.
I remember now. I remember somebody came up. If you look at the video, there's a lot of shoulders and arms and body parts. That was obviously kind of in reference to the arms and legs and all that stuff.
That we're missing.
Yeah, all that. So, and I think, at that time, the biggest source of inspiration was what everybody else was doing, because that gave us the exact, sort of like, this is what we have to avoid.
Yeah.
It became always the antithesis. You turn on MTV, it was color, it was light, it was life, it was hair and makeup and people jumping around and fun and silly and all that type of stuff. No names mentioned, but everything was just like, we want to do the opposite of that. And it was just like, okay, black and white, low lit, body parts, all that. It was just sort of like, let's just do the opposite. It was the total contrarian approach to what everybody else was doing.
No feet walking, no milk in the snare drum, no,
Yeah.
No partying.
And was it in Long Beach?
Yeah.
it was
Yeah,
in
it
Long
was
Beach.
Long Beach,
Yeah.
right? We were playing a couple shows at Long Beach Arena. It was a day off, and we came
Yeah, it
down,
was
and
a
we were in
big,
this giant
empty
warehouse.
factory.
There was nothing sexy about any of it. I mean, this was just
Just us.
cold. It was
It was
just
cold.
cold and just sad, and exactly the way that it should be.
It's
what I
exactly
mean?
the way the song was written
Well,
and
exactly the way it
sounds.
should
Sad.
be. Yeah, no, it's just, but it was incredible because when you think about the source, when you think about, James telling his story about his brothers and all that. I mean, you think about, I remember Cliff Bernstein also talking about the book and the movie, and when you just think about that literary piece, as a source of inspiration, and then it sort of ended up being the cornerstone of the video, and just bringing something completely different into the MTV generation at that time. That's kind of a mind fuck, the way that all worked out. I mean, I remember we were in San Antonio. We had a day off in San Antonio. The biggest thing at that time on MTV was called Dial MTV, and it went Monday to Friday. I think it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. People would call in, and we're like, maybe there's a chance. Maybe we'll bubble under. Maybe, we'll be number 10. Maybe we'll be number 9. I remember we were all sitting in our hotel rooms, or some of us were, or whatever, and there was the MTV countdown, and fuck, the video's not there. you know, and then we ended up debuting at #1 on the first day that it was available for dial MTV. It was like, holy fuck, that just threw everybody, but also kind of solidified what we talked about before, about all these people that were out there, the voiceless, that wanted something different than what was being served to them for all those years, and all of a sudden getting a chance to unite behind something that spoke to them or spoke for them. You know?
But it was interesting because you were also building on something, because one of the things, and I wrote about this in the story that I wrote in '88, which was the first piece that you had in Rolling Stone, was that after every show, I saw it in Sheffield, Belfast, and Dublin, after every show, there would be tables set up in a hallway backstage, and you would sit there for an hour and a half after the gig and just sign arms, take pictures, you know, talk to people, and in a way that was very deliberately and I think genuinely engaged with the people that had come. They weren't just standing at the backstage door, stage door Johnnies waiting for you to rush through to get an autograph. You actually invited them in. And it really, that really caught my eye, because I could see the way your audience had built and that you were still cultivating them. Actually, cultivation is the wrong word, because it sounds like you're actually trying to just grow popularity. You were actually connecting with people in a profound way that the video actually just solidified.
Yeah.
Well, the connection was the main word there for me. And I don't know if it came, maybe we grew up, well, the band grew up listening to a lot of punk rock, and we were hanging around with a lot of punk bands, and that was the attitude. Like, we're just another dude, you know, come on in and hang out, and, you know, there's nothing special about us. Anyone could do this.
Yeah, that part, I think we prefer to hang out, drink beer, shoot the shit with our fans. That was not about growing in numbers. That was just, it beat sitting on the bus talking to the fucking road crew or whatever. No disrespect to them, but it was like hanging out with, those were the people that we wanted to be with, because they were us. We were all in this together. You know what I mean? And so every night, sitting there and drinking beers and doing that kind of thing and shooting the shit with the people that come to the show, that was just a natural extension of our personalities.
Did you miss that when one and that kind of success almost made it harder to do that?
It is a juxtaposition. It kind of defeats the purpose in a way. And I do remember some of the shows, you can't, you know, whatever it was, we're in Buffalo and it's 20 below, we're not going to stand outside and sign autographs. And I remember we were riding through, and there were some people out there saying, "Did Rolling Stone lie to us?"
Yeah.
Remember that?
What about the kids?
Totally remember that. Yeah.
What about the kids?
And oh my God, it's like, oh my God, stop, turn around. You know, at some point you have to have a reality around the whole thing. I mean, like we do now. I mean, we do a meet and greet. It's different than how it used to be, but it's the main, you know, the prime directive is talking to people, not so much signing this or do that or I want this from you. It's how about some conversation? Yeah. I want to know about you as well.
Back then, we didn't really have boundaries. We didn't believe in those boundaries between the audience and the stage. And we were just like, you know, we were pretty much open to just about any sort of like fan sort of a situation. And of course, as you said, you know, when the band got bigger, there came a point when it was physically impossible for us to not have those boundaries. We had to put down boundaries for the welfare of us, you know, the welfare of the band, because after a while it just got too big and demanded too much from us, where other things would suffer.
But it's interesting because I think what you did was you adapted to the change in conditions, because the next tour, and I want to ask about the Doris and the statue in a minute, but on the next tour you had the Snake Pit. So you actually had people inside the show, actually inside the stage, who could really, and you're playing in the round. And you've done that for years. So you've actually adapted the size of what you've achieved to this whole elementary point of communication.
Well, the crowd is the fifth member. They really are, and they're as important as as us up there. And we've always tried to. How can we get them closer? How can we get closer to them? Safely. No one else catches on fire but me. But how do we do that? How do we do that? Just besides a few people being able to talk to them face to face, but in the crowd. So lighting them now. I mean, we've obviously the Snake Pit was a real effort at trying to get them to feel what we feel.
Yeah, to vibe with them. That was our thing. We wanted to be able to vibe with the audience on a level that had not been done before.
Who named the statue Doris?
Can I just ask? Oh. I'm just curious. Sorry, because we're sitting here talking about the video, and I just got one question. If you want to ask, but when you were sitting there cutting this video,
Yep.
which is, I don't want to use the word legendary, but it's become somewhat iconic over the years. Did you feel? What were you feeling at the time when we were trying to sort of put this thing together that obviously there was no roadmap for? When you were sitting doing all the actual work on it, what were your thoughts?
Well, my initial thought was, who's going to see this? Because I had great doubts that a 7.5-minute song was ever going to make it on MTV. So I was kind of given a directive that I should make it shorter, and I think I showed you guys a shorter edit that was like 5 minutes. I don't think anybody ever saw that one. But my conundrum.
Pull that out of your pocket right now for an additional bonus track.
That's right. Now, the hard part was to try and tell the story of the movie, because I kind of thought that was what my directive was. It was not to take the lyrics of the song, because that was a piece upon it. It was evident what your purpose was in that part of the song. I thought I was supposed to expand the whole story and bring in all the other elements of the main character's life into it, and to bring the doctors. The doctors had kind of a very important part in the movie, because they didn't realize that this guy was alive. And I think I heard you talk about that earlier, that it's they thought he was brain dead, so they were just keeping him alive just to see what would happen. I think they were performing experiments on him. But the song, as well as the movie, was all this inner dialogue stuff. And I tried to present it at first just pictures from the movie, but it didn't make any sense, because you couldn't you didn't know what all the dialogue.
His head. What does that mean?
Yeah, it was. I mean,
it's
basically.
Not even in time with the drums.
Exactly. I mean, if you just use it silently, it really is just a guy lying in bed. So I had to open it up and try to sell the rest of the
But at
piece.
that time, there was no other videos that had incorporated dialogue.
That had a
that had a narrative.
a
at
narrative,
that level,
yeah.
right?
Well, that
Was that your
was
idea?
New. It was, because I didn't think it was working the way I thought it was it was presented to me to present back. I had done. I was mainly an editor at the time, and I had taken a lot. Everybody at that time, all the studios would have some big singer sing their lead song, and then I would put a lot of clips from the movie into it. But it was always a lot of action stuff, people laughing, cars flipping over, whatever the movie was. And I think maybe that's why I was suggested to you guys to come in. And I just realized that it was just this guy sitting in a bed, and there's a dialogue happening in his head, which happens on the soundtrack. But if you cut all that out, it's just a guy lying in bed, and it was pretty boring. So I thought, let's expand it to the rest of the movie and try to bring the whole the whole piece into it. And I don't know if that's what you guys wanted, but I had to try something. Well, actually, the first time that I delivered it to you guys, there was I remember having a nice long discussion with you, Lars, on the phone, where there was a lot of swearing and there was a lot of, this is our video, it's not about the movie, and everybody hates it, and you got to take all this out. And so I actually recut it, and I cut it to a performance only. I think that was the directive at the time. Let's cut all this shit out and let's just see what the performance is like. And that actually became the jammin' version.
That sounds,
Actually, I'm curious, Rob, what was your impression when you first saw that video?
Well, it's funny because I had seen the first videos ever done. When I was in high school, there was a class with Neil Bogart's Casablanca Records. And so I saw the Joan Jett video, I Love Rock and Roll, and Gary Myrick video, Making Plans for Nigel. So then all of a sudden, here's this, video that totally goes against the grain. And, as a lover of metal, I thought it was awesome, and again, going back to the look and everything about it, it broke all the rules.
How did you relate to the images of the body? And
Well,
the way
I saw the movie when I was a little kid,
Oh.
so I had an idea of where this band was going with that, and creatively, I thought it was brilliant.
The thing about One and the way all of the songs on the record really work as a piece, it's summed up ultimately by the cover, which is the Statue of Justice, but it's blindfolded, ravaged, tied up, and you use that on stage, and particularly when the statue would fall over at the end of Justice. That was really the beginning also of your approach to stagecraft, which is the kids need more than just four guys playing there with a backdrop. Like, did you feel that was a step forward? Were you concerned that it was becoming too Broadway? What was your feel about taking this concept on the road and actually making it visual and physical?
2 words. Iron Maiden.
Absolutely.
Iron Maiden.
Eddie.
Iron Maiden.
And Eddie.
Iron Maiden paved that way. I mean, when we got the crosses, a lot of it all has to do with resources. So on Ride the Lightning, we had a backdrop with a silvery logo made out of tinfoil because that was the budget. There was nothing beyond that. Then on the Puppets tour, we got the crosses. And that whole thing, and we were using the same guys at Iron Maiden. Were a guy named Charlie Cale, who was the #1 go-to stage designer, and Iron Maiden. Every record they put out, Somewhere in Time and Power Slave and Peace of Mind and all those records, it was all just about incorporating some kind of visuals into the stage set. They were the roadmap at that time, and they were the ones that did it better and cooler than anybody else. They seemed to always go above and beyond on the sort of the fan-friendly stuff that people could sort of really connect to. And so they were totally the roadmap. And so when finally there was some resources and we were playing bigger places, and we went to Charlie Cale again. And I think, Peter Mensch was pretty instrumental in a lot of that stuff at that time. And I think Doors was kind of somewhat inspired by Pink Floyd. The
wall.
Where the whole wall crumbled. I think they'd done some legendary shows in, was it L.A. and New York or something, where they built the whole wall and then it crumbled, and somebody said we should do our version. I mean, it's not like a rip-off or anything. It's just like a sort of inspired by, they build it and then it crumbles down. It's like, okay, we can do that.
But it actually takes the whole idea of justice for all, which is the last line in the Pledge of Allegiance, and makes it visual. Like, not only is Doris, the Statue of Justice, blindfolded and tied up, but she's basically ripped apart at the end of the song.
Yeah,
which is really kind of what the song is about.
I mean, a lot of that stuff a lot of that stuff at the time, and we've talked about this many times in interviews along the way. I mean, it was very literal references from books, from movies, from so on. Somebody would have a cool title. Somebody would say, "Hey, and Justice for All," and then I think in that case, I remember saying, "Wait, there's an Al Pacino movie, but it's called Justice for All." And then James and I would sit and look at that, and was there something in there that was inspiring? Maybe, maybe not, whatever. And then it was like we were very open to sort of whatever was going on around us. Other creative works that spark something in us. I can't remember, but I remember you and I watching that movie. I don't remember what came out of watching the movie, but I think the people that did we tell them what we wanted the cover to be like, or did they? I don't remember exactly, but I remember seeing that we were working with some designers or something.
Andy Airfix, wasn't it?
I don't think it was Andy Airfix at the time. I think it was I don't know, whatever. But we were very sort of open to a lot of input from different people at the time, and certainly the stage stuff that was definitely inspired by Iron Maiden's approach from bringing the album covers to life.
Right, having a mascot or a
Stephen
something,
Gorman.
You know, an Eddie.
Stephen Gorman, yeah.
Stephen
yeah,
Gorman.
yeah.
But definitely Peter Mensch has a lot to do with the stage production and ideas and things. And
Right.
hey, let's make this come to life. And it was a really cool idea. And
Well,
There was
being
also
di-
another guy that Peter brought in. Like Peter would say, he invented him. I invented that guy. A guy named John Broderick, who ended up doing our stage productions and our lights for 20x years.
came from the theater world, so
Yes,
it was really
exactly.
opposite of
Yeah.
bzz, big time rock and
Again,
roll.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like
not
James
just a
saying,
bunch of flicking lights,
contrary
but yeah,
to what a
atmospheric.
lot of, again, sort of popular rock bands would be doing or whatever. A lot of, like he's saying, theatrical approach.
Yeah.
Was this
Well, being
John
Danish-
Broderick.
Simpler with a little more quality
Yeah.
Yeah.
instead of just,
Atmospheric.
Being Danish, how did you
Being
relate to
Danish.
being Danish, how did you relate to this concept? That line does come from the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, how did you relate being in America to what the America that, in a sense, James was writing about in songs
Well,
like Justice,
we would-
Short as Straw?
I mean, when I came to America, just all the stuff that popped out of television, I remember just blew my mind. I came right at the time when, like, Jimmy Swaggart was, on TV, and Baker and all this organized religion stuff, and there was so much stuff about, like, the what was the guy in Virginia, Farrell, Falwell.
Oh, Jerry Falwell,
Jerry
yeah.
Falwell and all that. What was his thing? The PMRC and all that stuff. And James and I mean, we would just have a field day being contrary to all that stuff. We would sit around the Carlson house, watch TV, read an occasional newspaper, pick up on things that were going on around us. And so, coming from Denmark, just embracing, like, the oddity of all of that, and feeling, and James was kind of, we were just loners. Didn't feel like we belonged to any of the world that was coming into our living room, or the world that was around us. And that's where we found solace and found that we belonged to something by all the people that felt like they were loners. We all grouped together and created our own group. And that's when we felt like we belonged to something. And then over the years, that group grew in size, and at one point maybe even became bigger than the mainstream.
Well, one
And
of the
that was
thing-
like the craziest thing.
One of the things, James, you said when I interviewed you on the Snake Pit tour, we were talking about politics and the way Justice had really almost summed up Metallica as a topical band, a political band. And one of the things you said was that we got called a political band around And Justice for All, and it really scared us because that's not what we want to write about forever. Did you find that when you got to Justice, when you finished it, when you finished that tour and had been playing those songs for 18 months or so, that was kind of an endpoint, that you needed to change just the way you looked at the world, or that the world had changed around you?
Yeah, I don't know about either of those, really. It was more like, we don't like being labeled, no matter what it is. We don't want to be labeled a political band, because we certainly aren't that. I mean, I think the punk rock part of us was, just we want to complain about shit. Or, we're in our 20s and, this is our college. This is where we're discovering our opinions. What do we think of the world? We read a book and now we know everything, we don't like how it is, and we have a voice. We can say it. I think that at the end of the day, it polarizes people, and I think we realized that early on. So when you're talking from the heart, when you're talking about your story, your experience, people can say all they want about it, but they're not going to change your mind. They're not going to, this is always going to be right, because this is my story. And I think everyone's got an opinion. It's controversial, and we don't want to be a controversial band. We want to be solid. We want to be real. We want to tell the truth. Yes, we feel alienated. Who doesn't? If you do, follow us.
You also said, actually, on that tour, we were talking about, even actually on the 88 tour, you were talking about maybe having reached a point in the composition and the speed of things, of the music, that, that you can't go that much further. As you said this, there's always going to be somebody faster than you.
Right.
And you seem to realize that even on the Justice tour, which suggests that what then became the Black Album was already kind of germinating.
I agree that, competition's a great thing. We were fueled by a lot of hatred and a lot of fear that we weren't good enough. So those two things combined got us to where we needed to be in Justice for All. And I think at the end of the day, we realized, what are we doing? Did you hear this other band? They're faster than us. And so what? So what? What else do we got? We got, let's make it more muscly. Let's make it more powerful. Let's, I don't know. It helped us change our direction, realizing that was kind of a futile a goal to be the fastest or the most complex or, the craziest riff on the planet. That those are finite things, for us. We can only go so far. Someone else will do something else. Let's be unique. Let's just be ourselves and be honest with ourselves. And, what do we want to do next?
This is really one for the floor, so maybe you can all take a turn at this one. When you play songs from Justice now, and I've seen you play Justice itself a number of times in recent years, what goes through your head?
Usually it's what's the next part?
For me, it's just like it's similar for me. Do I remember the guitar solo or not?
So anything from the album or that song, Justice?
Oh, any from the album.
Yeah.
I'm always sitting there just going like, okay, what's the next part? Are we in the second chorus or the third chorus? Look at all the pretty lights.
I think for me, playing Justice, it reminds me of our stage back then. And I remember, trying to figure this part out of the song while, on stage, trying to figure out how do we play this. I'm not so much worried about what's the next part. That comes just from feel. But it reminds me of that tour.
Yeah.
It certainly does.
It reminds me of that tour.
Jump out of the way, Justice. Doris is going to hit you at some point.
Yeah.
Some part of her is going to end up on you or in the crowd.
There were a few times when just at the end of Justice, we'd have a big explosion, and part of the lighting would swing, and then Doris would fall down. And there are times when I don't know if it was the road crew's fault or the stage or whatever, but inevitably, every few gigs, Doris would come bouncing to the front of the stage, or there would be someone in the wrong spot, and there was there was a lot of mishaps on that tour, all based around, that song, because there was just so much production in that song. And, there was a learning curve with that song as well, playing it live. And I will always remember when the album first came out, when we first started playing that song. I mean, like you said earlier, Lars, by the end of the song, there was some long faces. And good thing we had an explosion and doors came down, because it actually seemed like that would wake them up, And, and
I got hit in
remember
the head
that.
with Doris. I got headbutted by Doris.
Yeah, I remember that swinging rigging almost took me out once, because I just totally forgot. And then I heard the explosion and just leaped forward, because I knew that
Doris was coming for you.
Following the explosion, there was like doors crumbling down and a big piece of lighting that swing back and forth over us.
I remember that.
And it was a part of the song where it's kind of complicated.
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
You're trying to do both things.
It was multitasking for sure. By the end of that song,
I got to ask you, Rob, as a fan, when you play Justice Now, what's going through your head?
Well, it feels like a very orchestrated piece. There's a lot of layers, which I think is great. I could, again, it reminds me of an orchestra, a symphony. It's very symphonic. But it's funny you're talking about this, because the other day I ran into a guitar player, Johnny Five. He plays in Marilyn Manson's band. And he told me that he was
Rob Zombie.
Was it Rob Zombie? Okay, wrong band. Rob Zombie. Anyway, he knocked over something, or he tripped over a cable or a line or something that kind of dismounted the whole system. And Lady Justice came down early, and he said that Lars...
Oh, the backdrop.
The backdrop fell.
Lars scolded him. He gave him a verbal beating, and he had fear in his...
He had to do push-ups.
Exactly, yeah. And I just...
He had to put it up himself.
So I'm hearing this now, and I'm in, 3 nights ago, I'm hearing this story, and it's
30 years
funny.
later, Justice is still it's still a topic of discussion. Well,
I just want to say one thing, which has been in my mind the whole time we've been sitting here, which is that when you sit 30 years later, it's like each record has Lightning is this, and the soundbite for Puppets is this, and the soundbite for Justice is this, and the soundbite for the Black Album, and then Load, and then the Haircut album, and then came the Garage, the cover album, then came the Symphony. Everything's like this, just like Justice is the aggressive, rhythm guitars and drums, no bass. It's like, I think there's a little more to it than that, and I think that for me, when you focus just on, so much of it is about what came before and the path that led to what happened in 88 and 89. And I think that sitting and trying to what were you thinking in 1988? It's like, I think you brought up a bunch of stuff. It's like, huh, what? Yeah, sure. That feels like it probably happened or whatever. But I think I think you just have to remember that a lot of this stuff was us just moving forward. And you said, what were you thinking, and did you plan this? So much of this stuff at that time was instinctive, and it just sort of moved, and it's part of a longer story, a longer journey, that still continues and will continue, hopefully for another X years or decade.
Well,
but in the way that we're sitting here now, it's just today is just it's still part of that story.
Well, the story continues tonight when you gentlemen hit the stage here in Pittsburgh. I want to thank you from the tuning room, Kirk, James, Rob, Lars, Michael. Gentlemen, congratulations on 30 years of justice and 30 years of more mayhem.
Cheers.
Yay.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks, David.